Welcome everyone to the Indigenous Connections to the Earth panel. I'm glad to see all your faces here and your screen pictures. We have some phenomenal panelists coming up today. So we're really looking forward to hearing their perspective and what's going on and how the Indigenous communities connect to the Earth. So we're going to start off today, just thank you for being here. And we're going to start off with some land and labor acknowledgements. On behalf of North Seattle College, we acknowledge that we occupy the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish tribe, a people that are still here, continuing to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering, dialogue, and learning space. We ask that we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. And one of our action items that we really focus on North Seattle campus is Real Rent Duwamish. You'll see the link there. We'll put the link in the chat for you that you can check that out as well. We'd also like to do a labor acknowledgement. We also pause to recognize and acknowledge the labor that created the United States and from which we all benefit. We remember that our nation is built on the labor of enslaved people who were forcibly brought to the United States from the African continent, and we recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We acknowledge immigrant labor and recognize that voluntary, forced, and prison labor contribute to the building and maintenance of our nation. We acknowledge that all unpaid caregiving labor. Additionally, we acknowledge the critical importance of uprisings for racial equity that continue across this country in response to equity and generations of structural racism against Black communities. Black lives, Black minds, and Black voices matter. Thank you again for being here. And what we're going to do with the panel today is, are any questions that you have, go ahead and put them in the chat. If you're streaming in from YouTube Live, go ahead and put them in the chat as well. And then we'll be monitoring those and we'll take your questions as the panelists come. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Thank you all for being here. And our first panelist, excuse me, is Keisha, Talking Waters DeFries Lawrence. Keisha Talking Waters DeFries Lawrence is a Rampo Lenape Deer Clan water and land defender. Talking Waters has a BA in International Relations and Global Politics and an MA in International Law from the United Nations University for Peace. Presently, she is building an initiative across Turtle Island, Sovereign Science, an Indigenous-led pre-prior informed consent procedure for all Indigenous environmental frontlines. Welcome, Keisha.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Your pronunciation was not necessarily wrong, but it's Ramapo Lenape. So the traditional lands, Lenape-Hoking, meaning Manhattan, the tri-state area, so parts of New York, New Jersey, through the northern Appalachian Trail into Pennsylvania. Although I grew up on Narragansett, Pequot, and Wampanoag territory, so eastern woodlands all the way through. And yeah, most recently I have been on the front lines of Line 3. I was at the Shell River campground. For those of you that don't know, meaning the Enbridge pipeline going through over 300 miles of Minnesota and Anishinaabe treaty territory. And that is kind of what sparked this initiative. I work for an environmental nonprofit, and much of my personal background and passions are to see science and what is now called traditional ecological knowledge, which is ultimately just Indigenous way of life, be environmental law and be environmental policy. And it's clear that consent doesn't necessarily, it's not given to us. It's something that we need to take and do for ourselves. And that includes scientific communication, and that includes being citizen scientists ourselves.
Thank you, Keisha. Next, we have Owen Oliver. Owen L. Oliver is Quinault Misleta Pueblo, comes from the people of the Lower Columbia River, Salish Sea, and Southwest Pueblos. He grew up in Ketchikan, Alaska, and Seattle, where he graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in American Indian Studies and Political Science. Through these disciplines, he's been able to create and manage projects that range from community work, art, education, and influence on local and federal policy. His work is concentrated in Indigenous education and cultural representation, a path that he's learned from his connection to the tribal canoe journeys. Recently, Owen published the Indigenous Walking Tour of UW, which is a reflection of Indigenous knowledge and placemaking on the University of Washington campus. In his free time, Owen enjoys trail running, writing about nature, and cooking seafood for his friends and family. Welcome, Owen.
Hey, thank you so much, Shakira, for having me. Close kind of way, Owen Ekanim. Hello, everyone. My name is Owen Oliver. I come from the people of the lower Columbia River, the Salish Seas, and the southwest pueblos of the Sleda. I feel I can't say that enough, even though it's in my bio. I just graduated from the University of Washington this last spring, and really do a lot of projects in Seattle. As my bio has said, I just published the Indigenous walking tour, which I should have a copy right here. And you can pick it up at the U bookstore and do a tour around the University of Washington. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but just really excited to be here in space with all of you and other panelists that I do not know of yet. So just excited to get this conversation going. Thank you so much.
And last but not least is Joseph Alec. Joseph Alec is Klakwat, Swinomish, Tulalip, is two-spirit and goes by they/them pronouns. Joseph is a Clear Sky youth intern and currently attends Clear Sky Academy, an Indigenous high school credit class taken at North Seattle College. Joseph also participates in the Nahali Land Restoration Project at Daybreak Star in partnership with Green Seattle and United Indians of All Tribes in 2021. Welcome, Joseph.
Hello. Definitely interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say, and for sure I'll say that I've done a decent amount of volunteering and been around a decent amount of stuff, and it sounds like I have a lot to learn from my fellow panelists, and yeah, it's nice to have a lot to learn generally about my own histories and stuff like that.
Thank you all and welcome. So if you are just coming in, I'd like to remind people to just keep on mute while our panelists are speaking. If you have any questions, please put those questions in the chat and we'll get to those questions as we come up. I'd like to take a moment and just give the panelists the floor, take about 5 to 7 minutes and talk about what project you're involved in right now, your area of study, just what you're doing. And Keisha, you are up first.
Yeah, so I my master's is in international law, and post my master's degree, I decided to, take my Indigenous passion for the environment and attempts to mold it with what I was studying. And that brought me into environmental law, and the passion that I decided to go forth with was the Arctic. I am still mind blown, and I don't know how many people know this on like a everyday level, but there isn't much legally binding for Arctic governance or Arctic sovereignty. Unlike Antarctica, that's only designated for research and nothing more, the Arctic right now, with the Northwest Passage being open, is subject to a lot of industrial usage, essentially, moving forward in capitalistic gains. However, the Arctic is an Indigenous region. There are Indigenous people there. There are non-Indigenous people there. But first and foremost, we're talking about a portion of the world that is vulnerable and determines what the rest of the world looks like. So I decided to go to Churchill, which is the sub-Arctic in Manitoba, Canada. And I was a research assistant at the Churchill Northern Studies Center and a citizen scientist. However, I try to bring in my indigeneity as much as possible, but I'm not an Arctic person, right? So after being there for a few weeks and working alongside Anglo scientists, I reached out to the Denny in the area to discuss what environmental pedagogies there are, but also stories. I think more times than not, our creation stories get viewed as folklore, but for every nation that has a story, there is scientific knowledge there. And for many of us, that is our first journaling capabilities, to be able to pass down stories. So much of what I'm working on now is taking those early experiences of what I call sovereign science and evolving that to different nations and different regionalities and issues at hand. Because not all of the eco side that we're all faced with is the same. And I say that, for example, the Thacker Pass that's happening right now in the southwest of the United States, we're talking about something that a lithium mine that will change air quality. So the scientific research that is there versus a pipeline in terms of water or soil research and the different cultural layers that are involved with these elements of ecosystems, being able to develop a protocol for how we want to know the environment is safe and how for those nations want to know the environment is safe. How do we mold cultural knowledge and laws? Because we're at the point where we need to determine, are we going to let companies keep destroying the environment, or are we going to stop them on all levels of humanity?
Thank you, Keisha, for sharing that. And Owen Oliver, would you like to share what you're doing, what you're involved with now, and just give us a little background?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I want to start off by saying, just thank you for everyone coming here. And it's kind of full circle. I went to North Seattle, not the college. I went to the preschool, actually. I grew up in Seattle. And I remember going out to North Seattle Community College for preschool. And my dad actually has artwork on the campus. So it's awesome to be back in this space with community members and really talk about the land that I love, my ancestral homelands in Seattle. Right now, I'm streaming from the Tiwa speaking people in Santa Fe, New Mexico, hence the Adobe. People get kind of confused by that sometimes. And especially when it's sunny out and people are like, it's raining in Seattle, Owen. I'm like, oh, I didn't look out the window yet. So just super grateful to, kind of be in one ancestral land while talking about another. And my connection to land has really been, centered and grounded in the annual canoe journeys. Something that my grandfather started back in 1989 when he pushed the Washington state governor during the centennial to include Native people into these celebrations. Native people weren't, thought about. And since that, he spearheaded the canoe revitalization. Canoes hadn't been carved in 60 years. And now we get to, I was, basically born in a canoe and never had a thought of never being in a canoe. But there was a time, due to assimilation and boarding schools that our canoes were taken away. So I've had this amazing experience of learning through the water and learning, the strength that comes about being on the water and the relationships that we have with our water. I went to the University of Washington and I really wanted to study aquatic and fishery sciences. I wanted to save the salmon. I wanted to be that scientist. But turns out I'm not that good at math or science. I like my own science, which we call Indigenous science. It's not the hard science. It's the soft science that really gets to your heart. And that's how we're going to change people. And I moved to American Indian Studies. And the change for me was really seeing my identity and really sharing my story with people and not being discredited about it, not, having it a second thought that this data wasn't relevant, that it was coming from me. And I could really prove myself through the agency and identity that I've already had. And I worked with First Nations and undergraduate club there, and we really did a lot of events about food sovereignty and, land back movements, because what we saw was, the improvement in the landscape and the connection to landscape really improved student success. That if students, native and non-native, felt more connected to the land, especially the University of Washington, where the campus is, not the institution itself, I'm talking about the land, then people were more engaged. They knew what was around them. They knew the plants and animals, and they felt connected, like they had their own story there. And that's what I really focus on doing, is creating stories and helping people see their stories within the land. I work for Headwater People, an Indigenous consulting firm. I've worked with them for about 3 years and do projects relating to the land and water systems. I had the tribal management and kind of culture of the firm, and I've worked on the Seattle Aquarium project. I didn't know if you guys knew this, but the Seattle Aquarium is actually building a whole new aquarium right across the street. So there's going to be 2 buildings. And I've worked on that project again for 3 years and have brought tribal consultants in and have brought, a conversation of how do we think about Coast Salish peoples in this situation? When we're opening an aquarium, how do we thank the animals for coming here? How do we welcome them into this space? How do we create native art? Get the right artist. How do we bless the space? So it's small things like this that really elevate Seattle's appearance as not only, honoring Indigenous people, but actively honoring the Indigenous knowledge that comes through, that comes out of colleges and, comes out of non, traditional schooling, and really elevates that. So, yeah, just constantly trying to innovate Seattle, and really make it for a place like all of our panelists and myself included. So that's a little bit about what I do.
Thank you, Owen. And Joseph, would you like to tell us a little bit about what you're doing as well?
I would say I had a decent amount of time where I just was a part of different student led leader things native led leader things like NALA in schools, and more recently with the Clear Sky and volunteering on the side with a couple of different things. And more or less I'd say the practices of saging and or giving land acknowledgements in each event that we follow through with and have throughout the last however long I've been a part of, which has been since the summertime. And there's different things highlighting different people's moments of when a book came out with the Ty Jeffries a little while back. They came as a person who would do the reading of the story with their writer in the recording, and helps speak about what it was that was important about the story for them, and for the two-spirit identity being open in some sense. And in class, a lot of the things, it's a mix of working around what guests are coming through and having history and art that are very Indigenous centered and have been very either eye opening to different subjects, to how things were with boarding schools by hearing out an elder at some point, and kind of going through with other youth that are around my age, learning of these different subjects and being a part of something that feels like it can bring us to a place of understanding our history and working through what our ancestors may teach us, um some important stuff of there's a lot I can speak about. I just can't exactly connect them all together. But generally, a lot of that work has been very motivational in some sense to what I can get into in the future with not only a career, but with getting alongside different orgs if I ever find another one that's I can see myself helping out or working with in some sense. And I know a little while back in October, I was doing the youth part of the volunteer thing for at least every Saturday, and it was the Na'a Ilihi Fund, and we're taking out invasive species and working with the area that was left and planting native species that would sort of heal the areas that were brought to those invasive species were brought to that area of Dibbrick Star, where we were doing that because of the history of like how it was a military base, and that they brought down like ivy or different plants that came from harsher environments that wouldn't let it grow too tall, but would live in those environments to extent. But when it would come down to a place like Debrick Star, it would start to choke out all the invasive in the indigenous species, and become like a tree, like on one of the trees, it would just go all the way around, and it was basically choking out the lives of a couple of different ones that we went at the roots of and cut. And as it happens later on, we pull stuff down, and in that, like every day for those times when I was working there, we would start it off by having a circle, saging, speaking of what we're doing, and having an elder speak the work that we were taking lives of the plants that were there, and to respect it with tobacco, and doing a prayer song, and just more or less giving us a space we couldn't exactly have for everybody who was in the like volunteer thing. Because being like an urban native, in some sense, I have ties to my culture and ties to different things, but they have either been cut from like socioeconomic things. Don't know how to exactly explain that part, but more or less, it's been very important to be a part of the work of like Clear Sky, in being an intern and helping out with the events, and just yeah, yeah. I think I can kind of space out a little bit, but yeah, that's at least what I can speak to right now.
Thank you, Joseph. So as you see today, our panelists come from various backgrounds, and there's an underlying theme of the connection to the earth that we all have, and how to preserve that. And going forward, it's not just preserving it for us, it's preserving it for the generations to come, and making sure that we have a home, a place that we can call home for everyone. And so thank you again for letting individuals hear your experiences and what you're involved in. I just have a few questions that I'd like to ask you. We did have someone on the panel or on the chat. Keisha, this is for you. Let me pull that up real quick. There was a term that you used to express your Indigenous identity. You said that you tried to bring their blank identity to inform their community sense efforts. And what was that term that you used to talk about your Indigenous identity?
Could you say that again? I think I
Yeah.
didn't understand.
So you used a term to express your Indigenous identity, and you said that you tried to bring your identity, this blank identity, to inform your community of your efforts. And this was a term that one of our attendees today haven't heard, and so they wanted to look it up. I don't know if it was indigeny. Like I remember hearing like a.
I'm not sure what I said. I don't know if I said just a variation of Indigenous, like indigeneity, or I don't know. I don't remember what I said.
Totally fine. Totally fine. Thank you. So let me grab our questions real quick. And if there are questions, again, panel attendees, go ahead and put those in the chat, and we're happy to pass those along. So this is out to all the panelists, and feel free to just chime in when you feel spoken to or it really resonates with you. How are changes to the earth affecting Indigenous communities?
I think that's a huge question. It's a great question, but it's a huge one. And I think one thing that Joseph, some of your comments made me think of are the amount of like intergenerational trauma, but also love that is present and gets passed down and expressed throughout different moments of like that coming of age story, and then even later on in life. And I think for frontline communities or people who are decolonizing themselves and kind of like returning to the culture. There is a lot of ecological grief, I think, that gets expressed, and being able to utilize that, something that is viewed as a negative, but turning it into passion and energy, I think fuels the thinking of always having a next generation in mind, and the fact that there can't be linear ideas for a round planet. It doesn't work that way. We're circular people for a reason. So I think in a positive sense, all of these changes are refueling that ancestral story that we all know and hear in our heartbeat and hear within the drum. But I think on a different way, we're now able to, we're all having a Tecumseh moment, like worldwide, Turtle Island wide, Indigenous people, we're finding each other. And I think it's because of the changes that are happening within our environment. We all feel it. There's gravity for everybody. But for Indigenous people, it's happening in a much larger sense internally, but also externally. Like we're talking about from an extractive community point of view, things that are happening directly in front of people's homes and things that are affecting people's wells and where they hunt. So in that, on both extremes, we're seeing a lot of relationships and realities that are just interconnected.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of a lot of things. And just, you know, that question is, I mean, that's the biggest question you could ask. I hope they get smaller after that. But I think I want people, you know, to realize that we've always seen, you know, the earth and the environment change. It's never been static, but we've moved with it. We use the earth and the land as a relationship, not a resource. We're not out here we're now seeing the drastic effects of how fast you can change it immediately. And what happens is you start to lose those stories because it's happening so fast that elders aren't able to share those stories, that aren't able to pass them down, as Joseph and Keisha were both saying. And, you know, kind of relating it back to Braiding Sweetgrass, I'm not going to spoil it, so I'll only say a little bit about the front, but that initial story of Sky Woman. Now, that story has been passed down since time immemorial, before written time. It's an oral story. And if you could think of drastic environmental disasters happening, let's say, you know, Potawatomi people, you know, freezing, or, you know, tornadoes, or, you know, sea level rise, and the effects of those environmental systems, that story might not be passed down. And that story might not have made it into that book. And that story wouldn't have been shared with us all today. And that's those drastic things that are happening when we look at the earth as an extractive resource. But when we look at it as a relationship that we can build with, that we can learn from, either from the water, the sky, or the land, we can see how we all fit into this process. And it's not to say that, you know, it's not to say that there aren't, you know, how people say, well, no people should be on the earth. Well, I don't like to see it as, you know, that eco-fascist vision, because we learn so much together and all of our knowledge systems come from the earth, and the landscape as a teacher. So maybe thinking about how those stories are passed down. And that's not because of the drastic effects. It's because of those calm and steady relationships.
Thank you. Joseph, did you want to add anything in? And please don't feel pressured to. It's whatever speaks to you. There's a few other questions too.
I think I had something. I just kind of forgot the question a little bit.
How are changes to the earth affecting Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I think I'd have to, like, I'd echo a lot of the same things they would say, or at least I agree with them heavily. And more or less, I think one of the important things I've kind of recognized over the however long I've been in Clear Sky and being a part of the Illihi thing was that we've always cultivated the land and been a part of the ecosystem in the sense of like we don't separate ourselves, like he kind of spoke to, which was like, oh, like humans are like worse, you go faster, some type of thing, where like we don't want, or somebody doesn't want exactly themselves to be in the ecosystem when we just exist in it in some sense, and that we live alongside things and work with what we can from everything that goes through, like in how a lot of like buildings or in how people work around making new things. A lot of people go towards looking at nature and different parts of that. I'd say so. There's always something like there that can either uplift you in what comes of the world in some sense. I can't get too heavy into that because out there go into deep thought and remember a lot of things.
Thank you. And Jim, can you bring up the next question, please? What is something your elders have passed down to you that you would like to continue throughout the generations?
I can go first. Now I'm thinking of tons of stuff, but I got to make it super cheesy. Um, no, I think, something that I think my elders have passed, down to me, especially through both, family lines, native and non-native. And it's kind of this, the importance of identity, and really being strong with that. With, the effects of boarding schools, we were, they tried to erase our identity. And they tried to, kill the Indian, save the man. And something that we've all have, either been reconnecting or have been born with has been a strong Indigenous identity, that in your heart, and you might not share it outwardly. But it's something you're Indigenous, and you walk with that. You walk like your elders are watching you. You walk like your ancestors are watching you. And we live in the 7 generations, 1 generation in the middle, 3 in the past, and 3 in the future. So really thinking about that and that sense of identity and agency, that once you know who you are and what you really want to do, there's no stopping you. And that's something that really I've been taught to, share and just really cherish and not take for granted, because I have so much privilege in that I, am so strong with my identity.
I echo that. And I guess to go the lesser cheesy and corny route, although that's one of my favorite 3 sisters, I would say to not take any junk. Like, just don't do it. I think, I come from a state recognized people who fled into the mountains, and our mentality, and it lives on and it's definitely visible, is kind of a fleeing one. And I think we're in this moment now, though, our youth and elders who might not be actively able to fight, but they've changed what dogma has been stuck in their mind to one of like, no, we can't go anywhere else. This is it. We're done. There's no more pushing. And I think that is something that has to live on. We can't be pushed anymore, literally, physically move from places, but we also can't do it with respects to identity or anything from the past, because we are still present now. We do have ancient teachings, but we have teachings now that we have to be able to pass down. And I think one thing that is so true from all of these different fires that are happening everywhere is that, we're living in an era, and I think the generation now is going to be creating new creation stories. And I can't wait to see what they are. And I think so much of what our elders have taught us, I think the next generation is going to capitalize on and make even larger, because they won't be pushed around. We're living in an era of demands within Indian country, and I'm so happy.
Yeah, it's sort of a hard question. Like I said before, a lot of the ties, like close wise, like grandparents and everything, they have their they have their sense of dislocated like reality and either mental illness or just like mental health in some sense. And more or less, I've worked around and been around like elders a decent amount and heard different stories from like storytellers that speak to different points of like how Roger Fernandez, when I was younger, I'd always hear him and he would never give a point of you like this is what the story means. He always opened it up and let the children, including myself, like speak to what we know of, and a lot of the time he would learn something or we would like form our own sense of like understanding what it was that is and what we can I guess improve upon, but I don't know how I can go too deep into that. But I do I do in the more recent time like recognize that either the ties to the importance of what different ancestors I've learned have done in the past or have like okay, blanked out, but I've more or less recognized in the time that I you can learn a lot from listening and in some way taking care of yourself with the other person in the sense of like if you or have felt in a fairly dysfunctional place or an almost functioning place and found that like through that however older my parents are to me and however much my elders in my life haven't had the best representation, we've learned to grow together in some sense through existing in the space of we are here in this sort of I guess resilient way, but more and more or less like we're here for each other and speak to the importance of our own history, like of empowering ourselves or recognizing that we've done anything good for ourselves in some sense. I don't know how far I'd want to go into that one, so I'll just end that.
Thank you all for sharing. I think it's really important the preservation of our elders, what's coming down and what's passing on, as well as what you all are thinking about passing on. Keisha, you hit on a great point of just what are some things, up and coming for this generation that's not going to take anything back, that's not going to be pushed around, that's not going to have to push, that's not going to be pushed through and pushed out. So I think you bring up really awesome points with that to just think about, as yourselves, what are you going to pass on and just something that you would like to carry and what traditions you've made and just your experiences with that. One of the questions we have for Keisha is what actions can people in Seattle and somewhere else and elsewhere do to join and support the efforts of water protectors at Line 3 and against other pipeline projects? So if you could speak a little bit about that, that would be awesome.
Wow, that's heavy. First and foremost, I think directly follow frontline media. I think it's safe to say, and we all know that money is behind a lot of media. So Rachel Maddow won't be talking about it. You need to be able to find Indigenous sources. And Indian Country Today is a great one, but it's not the only one. And when it comes to frontlines, a lot of the time we're talking about individuals that have started their own initiatives. So finding those hashtags all out for Wensinqua, like support Wet'suwet'en, Treaty Truck House 2, the Micmac fight. So there's a lot. And then we also have our people in the United States who are at the borderline and, Hurricane Katrina happened, but nobody spoke about what that did for Indigenous people. And much of their land is inhabitable. So their front lines are different, right? They need money, they need resources, they need carpenters willing to work pro bono. But when we talk about water protectors right now in terms of legal defense, the water protectors litigation, protest and law litigation, those are organizations that are assisting frontliners, but again, directly go to people. We live in a world where I think the transparency of money is not always there. And if you can do your part to be transparent about it, please do. And indigeneity is messy. So the federally recognized versus state recognized versus not recognized, and the type of aid that it comes or doesn't come with those categories. We need allies, we need support, but we need humble, honest support. So start first by finding that media and finding those valid sources. And from then on out, it's a matter of your personal action.
Thank you. And Owen and Joseph, if you'd like to speak on that as well, of what surrounding communities can do, what kind of community support can come through your activism, and what we can do to draw our communities together.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do a lot of work with Indigenous education, especially on the federal level. I work with the Center for Native American Youth, and we do a lot of advocating with members of Congress to directly support Indigenous language revitalization, Indigenous education through, BIA, but also getting state funds. One of the largest packages in Indian country was this last COVID package in the Build Back Better. And it had the largest investment in Indigenous education. And it jump-started hundreds of tribes to think about starting their language program, to have that money to begin doing that. And what I really advocate for is really investing in Indigenous languages. And there's many classes you can take, to learn the Indigenous languages in Seattle and greater area. At the University of Washington, there's a Southern Lushootseed class, which is the Indigenous language of this area of Seattle. And it's free for anyone. Anyone can take it. It's not free. You still got to pay tuition. But they have language tables, and that's where I really see support needed. And I see that in, monetary support to help, language classes start, but also to, do donations to, youth-run organizations like Clear Sky Unea. I mean, they do language programs there, and you can see that directly happen in your own community. So I would really look in your community and see where you want to put your funds to help Indigenous people or other people of color. And just think about, how are you going to see it go out in the everyday life? And it's just super important. There's so much ways that you can help out.
Joseph, can you speak a little more on the restoration project that you're involved in?
That just reminded me I was also part of another one that was more or less labor intensive, and not only planting but like restoring some plant life to the Washington River next to UW, like one of the smaller bridges or something like that. That was some work I did before, but more or less daily he funds. That one was very important in bringing plant life around the different areas, like the mounds, which I wish I could speak more to, because there was a lot said towards the Serpent Mountains that was created, if I can remember, like 50-40 years ago, like around the time that Debrick Star or something like that, maybe. I don't know, it's been kind of a minute since like October, basically, when I learned that stuff. But there's the I really forgot the name of them. But we put these blue flowers that are going to grow on the mound towards the pond that you can go to. And there was different people who came around, helped out, spoke about the stuff, like I said, with the military base and how, like, we use the apples trees that they planted. Like, we let them be indigenous because in some way we do need the food in some sense. And I remember that part being pretty interesting, like realizing that we could make cider with it. That was really good. But I don't know what else I can speak to, or what exactly you're asking entirely.
That's great. Just a little more information of what projects are involved and how it's feeding back into our community and back into the earth, and how it's also supporting Indigenous communities. Oh, and I know that we spoke a little bit in our first initial communications about you and salmon and the connection to salmon and Indigenous communities. Can you speak on that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think when we first reached out, you wanted me to talk about Braiding Sweetgrass, and I could talk about that book this whole time because it's an amazing way that people can, get to know Indigenous sciences and really in a non-intimidating way. I'm gonna really open up your eyes to, read more about Indigenous sciences, because there's a lot out there. It's not just Braiding Sweetgrass, I promise you that. That there's a lot of great research in books, like the work that they do at Daybreak Star. Sarah Gonzalez is great. And, just other friends that I have in the Coast Salish region. But I brought up the idea of, just talking about, Seattle and the Salish Sea. And, salmon are our resource. I mean, relationship, that's also a resource. And it's this relationship that we've given these intentions, that they feed us and we honor them with reciprocity and respect. We do a first salmon ceremony where you fish the first salmon and you give it respect, and then you let it go back. And this is actually a ceremony that's done all across the Pacific Ocean. They even do it with the Ainu in Japan, the same kind of first salmon ceremony. And that's that idea of respect. And I think people, especially in art, say, well, salmon's done too much. We've done salmon too many times. But that's what's, subsist our Indigenous Salish people since time immemorial. I mean, salmon is the number one food. And it's, I don't know, I can't speak more about it just because there's so many ways you can go with it. But, it's so connected to the orcas, to, the seals, to economy. We traded salmon, through potlatches, and it's just had a ripple effect. So it's dear and near, and definitely a keystone species that is so important to Seattle.
Thank you. And Keisha, I just have a question. When you triggered my mind to ask about other ceremonies that are given to the land when you're taking something away. So Keisha, are there any water practices that inhibit these kind of ceremonies, what you're seeing now and what you're fighting for? Can you speak a little bit about?
Yeah, I think at least the most common, and again, I'm speaking to my indigeneity, for naming ceremonies, you're supposed to be near water. And that is hard to do, and you're not able to do in good medicine and in good faith if you know that the earth is being penetrated, let alone poisoned directly under you or near you. So I think in terms of, and that's true even for a traditional birth ceremony, right? Like water is so sacred, from just the mere finding of molecules and creating an organism to even being able to have ceremony around water, thus requires that water to be safe and at a minimum accessible. And I think that's one thing we're seeing now, that for some nations, ultimately, we're fighting for what feels like dead water or a dead planet. And we're fighting for it because at the end of the day, we know that some of our traditions coming back and our presence will take that death and make these elements alive again. So yeah, I think in terms of being able to continue with certain traditions, it really is that access in terms of being able to safely, physically be able to enter a space, get to a location. We have nations that can't cross borders without being harassed. But then it's also making sure that what we need and the element that is sacred here is also actively healthy. And I think that's another aspect, that for every region, for every nation, there are these sacred elements that no matter what will always be a part of us.
Thank you. And Joseph, just on the plant side of things, are there ceremonies within the plants? You know, when you were describing cutting down the ivy that was choking out different trees, was there anything done? You said that there were sage smudges that were happening. Any other practices, ceremonial, to honor the earth before removing or adding to?
Oh yeah. I did say it earlier, but I might not have emphasized it too much. But there was the prayer was for the was because we were bringing tobacco. Well, it was prayer for the plants and everything, with the bell from the elder, and they sung their prayer, and we had every day that we were working, we had gotten some tobacco and brought it to a place that we felt was fit to be there in some way. And so every time we would get tobacco, put it in some part of the forest to I wouldn't know if commemorate was the right word for it, but it's a part of what we did.
Thank you. And in honor and time, I just want to ask this. This is a very deep question, so we're just going to scratch the surface. But can Western culture ever truly embrace a more mutually respectful approach to nature?
Okay, so I'm on the crazy wavelength here in the mental camp. I'm always stressed out from the way words are used, because if we're looking at a globe and speaking technically, we are the West. Indigeneity was the West first, and we were colonized, and the term West and that whole door, I think, got really misconstrued. But I think a part of being able to truly embrace respect means you have to be empathetic. And I don't fully see that happening across the board. There are some things that aren't transcending culture. And regardless of the nation, I would argue that what's not transcending is those grandfather teachings and how that ties into what it means to be a conservationist or an environmentalist. People have these careers, but these careers are ultimately teachings and ways of life. So how do you, go to school and have a career and then backtrack to what it means to be a part of a culture that gave birth to your career, that gave birth to how you sustain your life? And I think one way of that is empathy, but also identifying where you come from. And it doesn't have to literally be what a DNA test tells you. What type of environment do you feel the most at home in and comfortable in, could walk around butt naked in and love at the end of the day? Where is it that is home for you? I mean, the Cree introduced themselves by saying that they know where their belly button is, meaning your umbilical cord. Where do you have your umbilical cord on Mother Earth? I think that's where everyone needs to start.
Thank you. Very well said. Thank you. And I love the idea of the umbilical cord. Where is that on the earth, and what are your lands? Just because we've descended from somewhere else, we're here now, and really do. If anyone else would like to add to that.
You said it perfectly. Nothing to add.
Thank you. And are there any questions from the audience that they would like to ask our panelists before we turn over and go back to the Social Justice and Action Club?
I want to thank everyone for coming, and I feel privileged to know Joseph. Like, I know a celebrity on this panel. Woo! And that's all. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Good job, Joseph.
We are at 5 o'clock, and I want to respect your time and honor that. And thank you all so much for carving out an hour of your day and coming and speaking to us. We just want to, again, let you know that Braiding Sweetgrass District Book Ride Read is coming up. We've posted some information in the chat, and if you're North Seattle students, that's all on there. If you would like to get a book from them, that'll go through as well. So again, thank you to our panelists. You were amazing, and we are very privileged to have you in our space. And then there's just some resources that'll help you get more information if this was something that really interests you and piqued you and you want to get on board with. This also falls under social justice, hence why it's under the Social Justice in Action Club. So take a look at the resources. Keisha also posted some taglines for media that you can get involved in, and that'll help get media and activism and advocacy and just being able to take a stand as a community. More voices are better than just a few. So thank you again to the panelists, and if you'd like to stick around for the club, feel free to stay.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you so much. Nice hearing you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.